Welcome to the Plato Paradigm, a paradigm shift in reading Plato's dialogues. Episode 111, Meno 84e to 85b. Socrates had introduced the exercise with the slave as a demonstration of recollection, but we've seen so far that there's been no proof that the slave has looked into his soul to find knowledge. All he has recollected so far are things that have already been said in the exercise itself, or things that he should already have known in his earlier life before the exercise. For example, Greek words, a square, lines. So what does the demonstration actually do? We see Socrates misdirecting the slave. He has caused the slave to choose two wrong answers so far by allowing the slave to make wrong conclusions. For example, if they want a double square, it should be on the double baseline. And when they find that that isn't correct, then Socrates says they want an area between the original area and the one they now have, the 16 square area, so it has to be between those, and obviously the baseline between 2 and 4 is 3, which again is incorrect. All Socrates has managed to do so far is cause the slave to reach an aporeia. In fact, the slave was already there. He didn't have any answers to the questions Socrates had before the exercise. This didn't matter to him at all. But at least the obvious answers as presented in the exercise have now been used, and they are incorrect, and there is no other answer. There is no baseline upon which to base the double area. We recall that Meno also had an aporeia just a while ago, and possibly the exercise is an analogy with what Socrates has been doing with Meno. Did we see Socrates misleading Meno, misdirecting him to give answers which turned out to be incorrect? Yes. Socrates, for example, emphasized that he wanted to hear what Gorgias had said about virtue, and Meno obliges twice. The examples of shape and color which Socrates gives are all very bad in their different ways. And then Meno gives a third answer, which may actually be less misdirected than usual on the part of Socrates, since Socrates does ask for one thing, an answer about virtue which applies to all virtues, and it isn't really Socrates' problem that Meno gives a complex answer which is easily refuted. But now Meno and the slave are in the same position that they cannot find another answer. But they are not in the same position. The slave knows that the baseline for the double area is not 2 or 3 or 4. They are all refuted. But Meno still has all of his answers. He has the 2 from Gorgias and the other one he has made up. It's Socrates who wasn't happy with them. Meno still has them. It's as if he is looking at the diagram and still sees those lines there as possible answers in the future. So it appears that this exercise is performing a double task when it comes to Meno. It's showing how the conversation has been going, and it has this spurious attempt to prove to Meno that it is worth carrying on searching, as if we have knowledge in our soul which we just need to look for. What will be interesting now is to see whether the outcome of the exercise is also something we can apply to the conversation with Meno. So let's return to the exercise. And we've left the slave with no solution, no possible solution. He has to give a baseline, and there isn't one which they haven't tried. What happens next has to be looked at very carefully. Uk un estin haute gramme ek gonias es gonian temnusa diche hekaston tutonton chorion? Nai. Well then, is this a line from corner to corner, cutting into two parts each of these areas? Yes. We have to imagine that Socrates has drawn a new line, actually 4 lines, each from the middle of a line to the adjacent line's middle 4 times, so that we end up with a square whose corners touch the middle of each line of the big square of 16 squares. So this new square is diagonally positioned. As Socrates points out, each line of this new square divides the areas of the four square squares such that the 4 squares are now 8 triangles, and the 4 inner triangles make the new square. Un teteres hautai gignontai grammai isai periechusai tutito chorio gignontai gar. So these 4 are equal lines containing this area. Yes, 4 they are. Scope de peliconti estin tutoto chorion. Umanthano. So we see, even when the slave can actually look at the new lines and can say whatever Socrates wants about those lines, that they are equal, he still cannot conclude anything from what he sees. Uchi tetaron onton tuton hemisu hekaste he grame apotetmeken entos eu? Nai. Isn't it the case that that line has cut away inside half of each of those 4, in other words, the 4 squares, so that there are now 8 triangles? It's interesting that Socrates never talks about the triangles as such. He always talks about the divided areas of the squares. The slave says, yes. In other words, yes, the line has cut the squares into half. Posse un telicauta en tuto enestin tetera. Then how many of those squares, in other words, are in this big square? 4. In other words, there are 4 square squares in the 16 square square. Possede en tode duo. How many in this? 2. Here the slave has had to do a calculation. If there are 4 of those squares in the big square, and now Socrates is talking about the new square, which has halved each of the 4 squares, it means that that new square is 2. The slave seems to have calculated this despite 2 squares not being apparent in this new square. There are 4 triangles. Tade tetera toin duoin ti estin diplasia. And the 4 to the 2 are what? Double. Tode un posapun gignetai. Octopun. So this is how many squares? 8 squares. Again, the slave has done some calculating. He's worked out that the big square is 16, and it's double the new square, therefore the new square is 8 squares. Again, he can't see 8 squares. Apo poias grammes, apo tautes. From which line? From this. The slave points at the baseline for this new square, which runs diagonally from the middle of the 4-unit baseline to the middle of the left-hand 4-unit line, or in other words, the diagonal running through the bottom left-hand 4-square square. It's this 4-square square which Socrates now refers to. Apotes ek gonias es gonian tenuses tu tetrapodos? Nai. From the line stretching from corner to corner of the square? Yes. Kalusin dege tauten diametron hoi sophistai. Host e taute diametros onama, apotes diametru an hos suphes opai menonos, gignoit anto diplasion chorion. Panumen un, O Socrates. The sophists call this line diametros, and this isn't our diameter, which refers to a line going through a circle. This is a line going through a square from corner to corner. So that if the name for this line is diametros, from the diameter, as you claim, O slave of Meno, would come the double area. Absolutely, O Socrates. So if we want to know how the sophists teach this, they take a square and show that it has a certain area, and that if we want to double that area in a square, then we simply draw a line from one corner to another and use that as the baseline on which to construct a new square, and that new square will have double the area of the old square. Clearly, Socrates didn't teach the slave the way a sophist would, although it's interesting that Meno didn't stop Socrates even when Socrates gave the name of the new baseline. Surely the slave should have looked into his own soul and discovered the name there, because all knowledge is in his soul. I think we can say by now quite safely that there is no theory of recollection in this dialogue. We still have a few things to say about how the slave did find the baseline, and how this affects our understanding of what Socrates is doing with Meno.